I'm Sister Patty Johnson, and I'm the director of the U.S. Federation of Sisters of St. Joseph. And it's my pleasure to begin this series of programs that we're offering for candidates, novices, their directors, and the communities that they live with. So we're really grateful that you all are here. We're hopeful that we'll develop a series of resources that will be very valuable. Today, we're going to speak about the art and habit of discernment. And our specific topic is discernment's help in answering, what am I doing? What am I going to do with my life? Now, we have a very qualified speaker. I would point out that she has gone through the Federation Novitiate experience. And Sister Mary Flick serves as our Justice Coordinator for the Sisters of St. Joseph of Carondelet, St. Louis Province. She's also part-time at St. Louis University Office of Mission and Identity and is a spiritual director. She holds a bachelor's degree in communications from Maryville University, a master's in religious studies from St. Louis U, and a certificate in spiritual direction from the Aquinas Institute of Theology. I can tell you from my personal experience that Mary's passion is Ignatian spirituality, a fire that was stoked during her 25 years at St. Louis University, a Jesuit Catholic university. So with no further ado, I'm very happy to welcome Mary Flick. Mary?
Well, thanks, Patty, and thanks to all of you who are tuning in today and those who have come here today to be with me. And I'm delighted to be talking about one of my favorite topics, Ignatian discernment. As I get started, I'd like to maybe name a few of my presuppositions. Presuppositions are always really important. I'm guessing the fact that you're here today is because somehow, somewhere in your life, you have personally experienced the presence of goodness and love, the presence of God. And you have found that it's a presence you'd like to remain with, to dwell in for the rest of your lives. Maybe someone has seen that goodness, that love in you, and has invited you to live in and live out of that great love as a sister of St. Joseph. Maybe you have felt a stirring of something that's hard to describe, and you're looking for a name for it, for a way to make it real. Maybe you're looking for a way to name yourself, for a way to live this one wild and wonderful life that you've been given. Maybe you're looking for confirmation of your vocation. I remember saying to myself a number of times, if I could just know what God wants for me, I could just know. But I realized I wasn't looking for head knowledge. I was looking for something else. And I knew I wasn't going to find the answer I was looking for in a book somewhere. Because the sort of answer I was looking for is really not an answer at all. It's not something in our heads, but it's something we find in our hearts. And the way that we come to know it is not by deciding, but by discerning. I'm hoping that you are already seeing that when we talk about discerning something like our life's vocation, we're not just making a decision. It's not like the decision I'm going to make later on today about what I'm going to have for dinner. That would be too easy. No, discernment is not once and done. It's not a recipe we follow. It's not a problem we solve to come up with an answer that we want or we need. Really, I think discernment is the art of discovering God's will for us in the very concrete circumstances of our lives. I think it's a way of discovering God's hopes and God's dreams for me, for us. It's not unlike the hopes that a parent has for a child, or like we do for our friends. And so I think, like the call within that drives all artists to keep creating, discernment really is a call to a way of life. It's a habit of the heart. And it takes time to develop. It takes quiet time. It takes alone time. It takes time to know myself and my feelings, and to own my likes and my dislikes, to reflect on what moves me to good and brings me life, and what moves me to choose that which is not good and is not life-giving. So, a little bit of my presuppositions. I really am happy to talk with you this afternoon about discernment. But I think it's important that I credit my source. And I'll say most of what I know of discernment comes from my life's countless teachers in Ignatian Spirituality. So, what is Ignatian Spirituality? Well, as you might guess, it's named for Saint Ignatius Loyola. And Ignatius was a Spanish mystic of the 16th century. And he came to know God's love personally for him through a series of visions and reflections on his life experiences. And he wrote these visions and these reflections down in a book which he called the Spiritual Exercises, as a way to help others come to know God. I don't know about you, but I have to confess, I have not been blessed with visions like Ignatius. I think we've all had life experience. And what's more, I think we all have what Ignatius calls God's most direct way of speaking with us and to us. That way is through our thoughts, our desires, our imaginings, and our feelings. Our thoughts, our desires, our imaginings, our feelings are all open and ample space for God to most directly reach us. And I think it's by being attentive to these very personal stirrings, by learning to identify them and name them, Ignatius says, that we can find help in recognizing what God wants for us, what God is hoping for us, what God desires for us. But there are also some other helps in this way of life that we call discernment. And so let me explore some of those with you this afternoon. Some of the foundational insights of Ignatius in the discernment of spirits, and some of the practices that he found can be of great help. Well, I started with a few presuppositions. Let me also say discernment has a few presuppositions. First, discernment presupposes that life is a mystery to be lived, not a problem to be solved. Discernment also presupposes that life is a process of growing in relationship with God, with the world around us, with the people around us, and sometimes first and most importantly with ourselves. I hope that sounds real CSJ to all of you. It does to me, and that's because it's very Ignatian, and we are an Ignatian group. I think this is where we begin. And discernment requires that we begin at the beginning, with the creation of me, with my creation. I hope you know, as I know, that I am created by a God of love to love, or love. Or to use Ignatius's words, I am created to praise, reverence, and serve God. I think only if I can believe in God's great love for me, can I discern anything. I think one of God's dearest signs of love is the freedom that God gives me. God only wants my love if it's freely given. You know, God longs to be in relationship with me. God stirs my heart with desires to do great things. But in our world of free choice, and sometimes I think it's almost unlimited choices, I think that stirring can sometimes be missed because we can be distracted fairly easily by other spirits who lead us to lesser dreams. So Ignatius says that it's only by discerning between these two spirits, the good spirit that pulls us toward life and the false spirit that pulls us away from life, that we can come to know what God's will is, what God's desire is for us. So let me start by talking just a little bit about these two spirits. Ignatius says when that false spirit is at work in us, we're in a state of desolation. But when we're under the influence of the good spirit, the good and true spirit, the Spirit of God, we're in a state of consolation. So Ignatius defines these two terms. Ignatius says that consolation is being in a state of great faith, hope, and love. It's having a sense of God's closeness. And it's best known to us by the presence of peace and tranquility within us. When we're in consolation, we find ourselves stirred to do good. And we're transparent. Others see it in us. I think it's much like when Jesus saw Nathanael and he said, "Here's a man without guile." It's that sort of transparency. And it's only when we're in a state of consolation, only when we can sense that closeness of God. Ignatius insists it's only then that we're able to discern. On the other hand, is desolation. And Ignatius tells us that desolation is the way to describe those times when we're filled with that restlessness, that anxiety and agitation, when we're feeling bored or apathetic, when we find ourselves overwhelmed by fear, by worry, and when we find there are secrets in our lives. Sound familiar? I know I've been there. In desolation, we find it difficult to feel a sense of faith or hope or love. Often when we're in desolation, we even question our entire relationship with God. When we're in this state, Ignatius tells us we have to take special care to make sure we avoid making any sort of choice or any important decision. In this state, more than ever, we need the support of our mentors and friends and companions and church. And we especially need to be gentle and patient with ourselves and trust that God is going to make good use of this time, somehow, this time. So I think what discernment requires is that we notice these patterns in our lives and these movements within our hearts. I think this is a requirement that comes directly from the life of Ignatius himself. As I said earlier, Ignatius was a Spanish soldier, and he really had the longings of many of the men of his time. He longed to win fame. He longed to win the hand of the fairest lady of the land. He longed for success. But one day in battle, a cannonball shattered his leg. And it really shattered the life that he had imagined for himself. So he was carried from the battlefield on a litter to his family's estate. And there he spent months in bed waiting for his leg to heal. Poor guy. He was looking for something to help him pass the time. And he was hoping maybe he could get his hands on a romance novel or two. They had just come out with the dawn of the printing press. But unfortunately, the only two books his family had there were the life of Christ and the lives of the saints. Once he overcame his disappointment, he would start reading these books. And as he read, he daydreamed. He'd dream of what he had always imagined for himself, fame, fortune. But he found that at the end of these dreams, he felt dry, empty. And then he'd take some time dreaming about one of the saints that he was reading about. And he'd feel himself full of passion and fire, with a desire to do great things for God. And it was a feeling that would linger. And he would find himself saying, well, if St. Francis could do this and St. Dominic could do that, I could do just as much. And I think really this is the beginning of the discernment of spirits. Paying attention to our feelings, reflecting on our feelings, our knowledge, our desires, and then choosing to act. So, what can we do to determine and discern which spirit is at work in us? Well, I think we can find some help in those ageless practices that are common to this Christian spiritual life. And one is just really basic, but it's extremely countercultural today. And that is, get quiet. Take some time alone. Share with God what's on my mind. And listen to what God is sharing with me. Pay attention and notice how I'm feeling as I share. I think another is probably very cultural today. It's more easy. That way is to gather data. You know, the internet makes it extremely easy for us today. So I invite you to get out there and do some reading on the issue that you're facing or the issues that you're facing. We've got a great resource available to us with the Global Sisters Network or with the Federation page. Find a network of support that will help you during this time. Giving voice is one of the great gifts of these days. Most importantly, take time for some daily prayer and brainstorm with God. Ask God for holy indifference. And that's a crazy term. Nobody uses that term, except Ignatius. Because indifference sometimes makes us feel like we don't care, but that is not what it means. Of course we care. But what Ignatius means by the term is to let God know that I am willing to accept either way, as long as it's God's way. So, set a deadline that's realistic for you. That's why it's so important to know myself. Because if I'm a procrastinator, I need a definite deadline. And if I'm one of those people who's very impatient and hurried, the type A personality, I've got to give myself some extra time before I make a decision. So know yourself, but give yourself a deadline that's realistic in whatever you're trying to discern. This next is a practice that hardly seems like a practice. I'm going to invite you to dream. Ignatius encourages us to dream big dreams. Let God dream inside of me. Ignatius tells us that God dwells within our desires. And we find God there if we get into the deepest desires of our hearts, trusting that God has placed them there. So reflect on your dreams. Reflect on your desires. Hold them in balance with your other options in life. See what captures your heart. What gets you excited? What stirs something inside of you? And finally, the last practice, ponder. We read in scriptures that Mary held all these things, pondering them in her heart. So I invite each of you to let the options play out in the quiet of your mind and heart. In which dreams of yours do you find a pleasure that lingers, that stays with you? Where do you find peace? What gives you energy? What gives you consolation? Or is what I'm pondering leaving me restless, kind of feeling deflated, defeated? So I find myself feeling as if I'm in desolation. I'm going to leave this first half of the talk with an image that we find in the spiritual exercises. Ignatius gives us some images for the good spirit and the false spirit. He says the good spirit is delicate, gentle, and delightful, like water penetrating a sponge. That's the good spirit. That's the way the good spirit works. But the false spirit at work, he says, it's like a drop of water on a stone. So with that image of good spirit, false spirit, peacefulness, disquiet, I'm wondering if there are any questions.
I'm wondering if you could say just a little bit more about that holy indifference, because I get the whole consolation and desolation, but it sounds like you attend to those, but you want to move towards that holy indifference. Can you say more about that?
Yeah. Again, holy indifference is Ignatius' experiment, so we don't quite get it. That's a term from the 16th century. But it doesn't mean that I don't care or I don't have a desire or want specific. But it's more like what we find Jesus experiencing in the Garden of Gethsemane, where he comes to that point and doesn't come immediately, but it comes to that point where he can say, not my will, but yours be done. You know, it's not something we come to easy, but it's something that Ignatius says, even if I can't say, I want what you want, God, Ignatius invites us to maybe try saying, God, I want to want what you want. And if you're not even there, if you can't even say that, then Ignatius says, try saying, I want to want what you want. You know, go as basic as you can. The key, though, is to be honest and to continue to be open. And to come to that place where, like a balance, I can find myself going this way or that.
I wonder, this is Barbara. Can anybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, okay. So I appreciate what you're saying, so much, Mary. But I wanted to ask about this paying attention to feelings and to what happens within you. I really appreciate, because it certainly has been my experience. And the need to be in quiet and the need to look at facts. What concerns me is I never remember my dreams. And so I don't know if you could talk a little bit about how that fits into your experience.
Sure. Yeah, and dream is often the word that we use when we're thinking of what's happening at night, and so it's in the subconscious, and we're not always aware of it. I have to confess, I don't remember many of my nighttime dreams. But I think maybe what's even more important is to talk about our daytime dreams, our daydreaming that happens.
Oh, good point. Yeah.
So I think that's a better way to look at that.
That is. So like what you find yourself thinking about.
Right.
Yeah, okay. That's good. Thanks.
Yeah, those things that come to you when you're driving down the road, you know, taking a walk around the block. That's really where those dreams surface.
Oh, okay.
You know, the other thing I think that's tricky about dreams is that sometimes they don't always mean what seems obvious. So when you talked about having friends that could help you or people that could be a mentor, if I was going to mess with dreams, I'd probably want someone who had a greater understanding of them.
Understanding, yeah.
Definitely. That's always and that's going to be some of what I'm going to talk about in the second half. I'll say yes, that's definitely what's at work here. We need help. None of us can do this work alone. I think what I've been sharing with you are really some very general comments on discernment. The formal term that Ignatius uses is discernment of spirits. That's, we talked about consolation and desolation primarily. And as I said at the beginning, there's no real formula for discernment. But there are guidelines which Ignatius provides for those who have a very serious life decision to make. Like one's vocation, kind of serious. Discerning what we might call God's personal hopes and desires for us. We're way far ahead of the game if we've got a few helps in this regard. As you might be able to tell from some of the ways I've been talking with you, I know that I am not talking to a group of people who are trying to discern between good and bad in their lives. It's very safe for me to assume we're all about discerning between goods. I would say we are trying to discern the greater good, as Ignatius would call it. So your question is, what is God calling me to? What is God's hope for me? And as I said at the beginning, quoting Ignatius, he tells us, we are all called to praise, reverence, and serve God. That's our goal in life. That's why we're here. And I think as Christians, all of us as Christians, our goal is to be a disciple of Jesus. The question is, how? How do we do this? I think we find ourselves oftentimes making our decisions backwards. We say, I want to do this in my life. Now, how can I do this and somehow praise, reverence, and serve God? How can I work the means around to the end that I want, the end that I see? But Ignatius says, start with the end. The end is being a disciple of Jesus. So how do I live the Christian life to the best of my ability? I think the good versus good dilemma that we often find ourselves in, that we do particularly when we're discerning our vocation, has some helps that Ignatius offers. Basically 3 ways in which we discern. There are different ways that we come to a discernment. The first way is, I think, kind of an unusual way. We'll talk about that. The first way to discern is when the way is perfectly clear to me. I have absolutely no doubt what I am to do. I know what God wants for me, and I'm at peace with it. I look in Scripture and I see the call of Matthew. He just got up and left that tax collector's table and followed Jesus. Or we see it in Paul, knocked down on the road to Damascus, gets himself up and goes on and becomes one of the main apostles of Jesus. And I say to myself, I find myself saying to myself, if it could only be that clear. I could only be that certain. But I have a friend who's a Ignatian theologian, and he says, he has told me a number of times, that more often than we think, the decision is that clear, but we're not willing to accept it. And so we have to put ourselves through some of the other means of discernment, and that's okay too. So the second way of discernment is when a decision isn't so clear to me, and I find myself being pulled in different directions. This choice seems better than the other, and then not. It's a lot of back and forth seesawing. And that's when I find myself needing help to discover what's leading me to God and what's not leading me to God. I think that's when we most need to pay attention to our feelings and the root of these feelings. talk about that in a minute. The third way that Ignatius identifies is to make a decision when we're basically at peace. There's no strong movements one way or the other. We're open. And we can honestly ask God, where do you want me to go? That's, I think, some of that holy indifference that I talked about earlier. In this state, Ignatius gives us two suggestions that will help move us along when I find myself at peace and can say, either way, show me which way, God. One way is to bring the decision before God and just simply sit down and write out the pros and cons of following this decision. And to say to God, I don't know what to do. What do you think? You know, I think we're great at giving advice to other people. I'm sorry, wrong sentence. The pros and cons help us because we tend to be rational people and we like to put things down on paper. So I can make a list of pros and cons for becoming a sister of St. Joseph. But it's not enough just to look at the pros and cons for that choice. I also have to look at the pros and cons for not becoming a sister of St. Joseph. Perhaps for becoming a married woman or becoming a single woman, active in my faith community. I think the thing about the pros and cons is that it uses our reason, and it's often very consoling to those of us who like to be logical thinkers. The thing is, we've got our feelings involved, and I think oftentimes our feelings work when we give them a little space in our imaginations. And so Ignatius gives us another suggestion for coming to a decision, a discernment. And he offers us a couple of imaginings. He says, imagine a friend coming to you with the decision that you're facing and saying to you, I don't know what to do. What do you think? I don't know about you, but I feel like I am really great at giving advice to other people. And so when I have this objective perspective on the question, I stop and I say, okay, what would I say to her if she asked me? And then, what can I hear myself saying to myself? Another imagining that Ignatius offers is for us to imagine ourselves on our deathbed. Pretty stark, pretty decisive. Or, Ignatius says, imagine yourself on the day of judgment. You know, if they're at the Golden Gate with St. Peter. What choice would you wish you had made? I think this kind of imagining gives you a big picture and helps you to name the regrets you want to make sure you avoid in your life. I think that particular exercise was probably the most significant for me when I was discerning my call to religious life. I imagined myself on my deathbed saying, oh shit, I wish I'd been doing religious like I thought I should be. I think in discerning, it's important to remember the whole person that I am. Yeah, it's important for me to use my mind and my heart. So the pros and cons help me, but so does the imagining. Use my reason and my imagination. And always use my feelings. I think there are two other practices that are of great help when I'm in the process of discernment. This is sort of what we were alluding to earlier when we talked about dreams. The first practice, I hope, is one that you all already have. I'll say it anyway. The first is spiritual journaling. And I really recommend that you do it on paper because it slows us down. Now, you don't have to be a Pulitzer Prize-winning author to journal about your life or to journal about how you're feeling. But you do have to do it with frequency. You have to do it regularly. So I understand we can't do it every day, but maybe 3 times a week. Or at least a minimum of on the weekends when we have a little bit more time. I think you'll find, I hope you'll find, you'll be amazed at what's coming to you. by developing this habit and doing it on paper. As I said, paper slows us down. So does handwriting, if you can remember how to do that, you know? It really does slow us down, brings us inside. Now, don't worry, it will not be graded on your penmanship. You're the only one reading it. But I think I can pretty much assure you that you'll find within yourself words and phrases and feelings that you didn't even know were inside. If you can put that pen to paper and journal about what's moving inside of you, where do you find God? Here's an even bolder suggestion. Try writing a letter to God. No one ever needs to know. No one else is going to read it. You know, your relationship with God is yours alone. So be frank, but be honest. Explore who you are and do it with confidence. God loves you no matter what you say. I think the second practice is equally important. It's the practice of spiritual direction. It's an ancient practice, really, of the Christian community. It goes way back to the Middle Ages, or maybe even to the Dark Ages. Who knows? We don't have anything left from those times. But it goes way back to the time when the monasteries were the center of culture and religion. And the monks and the nuns were the ones who were sought out to hear people's deepest secrets and hardest questions, because it was safe to share it with them. These days, you know, there are many training programs for lay people as well as vowed religious and ordained who believe that they have this gift to share with the larger Christian community. Spiritual direction basically invites us to sit down on a regular basis, often monthly, with someone who's experienced in their faith and experienced in helping others journey through their faith. Someone who's willing to talk about God, about who God is, where I have found God in my life. I often think of spiritual direction as a hidden treasure of Catholicism. You know, to have a person of faith listen to me share my faith and my struggles in my faith, not judge me, but encourage me to continue on the journey toward God, with God. You know, spiritual direction is working with one other person in particular, but we all find ourselves at times sitting down with other men and women of faith who are trusted friends on this faith journey and sharing with them. It's not quite the same, but there's great value in that. And so maybe that's where you share some of your dreams, some of your daydreams. It's important to play it out and to hear other people respond, because that really helps us in the process, get an objective opinion. And I think that's some of what I'm going to end with here, is the need for confirmation. Debbie?
So a question has come up.
Oh, good.
I'm asking, could you just share a little bit about distinguishing the characteristics of depression versus desolation? How do you know when you're dealing with more of a mental health issue than the spirits of desolation?
Now that's a good question that I can make an attempt at. I don't have much background in the mental health area, but desolation is very much a spiritual place where we find ourselves feeling that restlessness and that anxiety that I spoke of. We can pretty much continue to function. You know, we're out there in the real world doing our daily duties, but there's something that's just not right within us. I'll share from my own discernment process when I was looking at religious life. You know, I had a very full life. I had a great group of friends and lots of things that kept me busy in my after work hours. And people would see me and I was full of, you know, ideas and energy and like to do things. But when I'd go home at night by myself and I'd be alone and I'd say, is this all there is to life? Isn't there something else I'm supposed to do? You know, I would find myself kind of coming back into myself and feeling just kind of deflated, defeated. It wasn't life was good, but there was something more, and there was just this great restlessness that I had inside of me. It didn't hinder my functioning in the real world. It didn't hinder my relationships with others, but there was something else inside of me that I needed help with. And I was talking regularly with the spiritual director. Now, sometimes these signs of desolation may cause you to wonder, maybe I am experiencing some sort of mild depression. There may be some other things at work. It never hurts to contact, a counselor or someone else to kind of help you discern what it is that's at work. But that's my best feeble attempt at defining that. Another question?
Yes. So I'll ask, on that note, I think my experience with discernment is also that restlessness, but there's a rhythm to it. And you will tend to find yourself going out of it and into it and out of it based on your dreaming or how you're thinking about your life. And I hear that, I don't know. And, but with depression, it's harder to, whether it's usually a biochemical issue or sometimes just situational, all the way to clinical, but you have more difficulty coming out of that desolation. You kind of stay stuck. And that begins to feed our thoughts and all that, begin to feed on each other. So when you talk about, what I really appreciate you saying was when you talked about desolation as restlessness or bored, apathetic, fear, or anxiety, that those are normal emotions to pay attention to. But oftentimes I will feel guilty when I'm in apathy or if I'm bored. Maybe that's a time when I eat or I start developing, I start thinking about decisions or I make poor choices, and then it can lead easily to habits. And so, and at the same time, you said God is going to do something good in that time. So it's that constant union with God, I think, that helps us to move through that. And friends and spiritual director that calls us out to move beyond where we are.
Yeah, Ignatius has a term that he uses, agre contra, and I don't know Latin, but that's the term that's in there. But what he says is when we find ourselves in this time of desolation, we need to spend more time in prayer. We do need to do more acts of more practices, Christian practices. So that might be when we need to try a little fasting. So instead of praying, let's say I'm praying 20 minutes, 30 minutes a day, and I'm feeling this desolation, that's when I need to up it and pray 40 minutes or 45 minutes. If I'm not doing any reading, to start doing some reading. I have to kind of go against what's happening for me and in me. So, anything else? Good to go with this very short closing? Okay. So, when I've entered into the discernment, I found the help I need, and I've given it the time it demands. Hopefully, I will come to a point where I feel like I have reached a discernment. Now there's one more thing I need to do. Since I have not discerned alone, that's what we were talking about earlier, I offer my discernment to God, who's my constant companion. I offer God my decision, and I ask God to accept and confirm that which I have come to know, or not. Now, this kind of confirmation I'm talking about doesn't mean that I wait until I have certainty before I act. I do what I will call a gut check. That's how I do it. I do a gut check. How does it feel? Do I sense a rightness in my decision? How easily are doors opening for me as I move toward this option? Am I feeling at peace? to use the Ignatian term, am I in consolation? I think oftentimes this is also where friends can be of great help. And they can give you their sense of what they see in you. Are they seeing a rightness? Are they seeing a peacefulness in you? Are they seeing a joy in you? All being said, I hope you see discernment is a process. It's a process of growing in trust that God is going to lead me the way God wants me to go. And that I will discover this deepest desire of my heart and of God's heart. I really will, however long it takes. Struggle often is to get to those deepest desires and to live them out. But if we do, we will find that peace that we so desire. We will find that peace that lasts. And we will know for ourselves the hope and the dream that God has for us, for me. Because our hopes and our dreams, like love itself, is very personal.